And hello, YouTube. This is Thomas Judge back once again with another installment of my series Popular Comics It's Okay Not to Like, in which I talk about some popular comics that I personally don't like. And we talk about the pros and cons of the various comics, and essentially I do what I can to kind of break a bit of a comic book echo chamber around particular comic series and particular comic writers, and especially hopefully empower some people out there who are listening to not necessarily feel obliged to like or enjoy or to promote or support particular comics if actually it turns out that they don't like them. If you don't like these comics, you're not alone. In previous installments, we've talked about things like Watchmen, we've talked about things like Mouse, we've even talked about All Star Superman, and today I want to talk about Preacher, the comic book series published by DC as part of their Vertigo imprint, back when Vertigo was a thing before they wound that down and started their Black Label. Now, this video is going to be, I don't know how long it's going to be, but it's going to cover quite a lot of things. I'm going to start off talking about Preacher, but there's no way to really talk about why I'm not a fan of Preacher without then going into Garth Ennis and talking about some of his other much applauded, very popular series that I also don't like and why. And then we're going to talk about the series of his that I do really like and why. And then it's going to hopefully lead into the next episode I'll do, which, well, I won't give you any spoilers here, but you'll see. So we're going to start off talking about Preacher. Preacher was written by Garth Ennis. It was drawn by the artist Steve Dillon. Like I say, it was a Vertigo publication. Vertigo was an imprint of DC Comics. They also did stuff like Lucifer and Sandman and Fables and stuff like that. So most of those series, they're kind of like a Vertigo hallmark is that the series that they publish 75 issues in total, and that's the same with Preacher. There were 66 regular issues, one every month. There was a 4-issue miniseries called Saint of Killers, and then there were 5 one-shots. So that was the entirety of Preacher. It was published in the late 90s. I think it finally finished being published in about the year 2000 or 99 or something like that. It's been collected in a series of trade paperbacks, like loads of trade paperbacks. I think there's like 10 of them or something. They also did some like big, thick, epic collection type trade paperbacks, which just collected more issues. I think there were only 4 or 5 of those. And then they collected them in the Absolute Preacher oversized editions. Now, I'm a massive fan of Absolute editions. I don't own the Preacher ones because I don't like Preacher. But I would say if you are a fan of Preacher, these Absolute editions, by everything I've seen and everything I've heard, these are incredible. Apparently, they are absolutely beautiful. And if you're a fan of physical comics, these really are top tier, top shelf physical comics. So if you're a fan of Preacher, you really, really owe it to yourself to try to get hold of the Absolute Preacher volumes because they do look beautiful, even to me. So let's quickly talk about what Preacher's about. So Preacher's about the story of this guy called Jesse Custer, who's a preacher in a small Texas town. Long story short, he gets possessed by this magical spirit, which is something called Genesis, Genesis is the offspring of what happens when a demon has sex with an angel. It creates this kind of Genesis thing, and that then like escapes and it goes to Earth and it takes over Jesse Custer. And also, upon the birth of Genesis, apparently what happens is that God then just leaves his throne and disappears out of fear or in hiding or whatever it is. Anyway, what this really means in a functional way is that once Jesse is possessed, he possesses something called the Word of God. And the Word of God means that when he talks normally, he talks normally. But if he wants to, he can focus and he can say something, and whatever he says will happen. Like people will do it. Now, it's indicated in the book using red font in the comic, and that's to indicate that this is him using the word of God. And that kind of like plays into how Bibles and particular things used to be printed back in the day. They used to have particular bits of them in red to indicate that that's like God or the voice of God or the Metatron speaking. So, long story short, that's what Preacher is. And then the entire story, all 75 issues, him basically doing a road trip across America. Randomly, his best mate ends up being this Irish vampire. Weird. And then his ex-girlfriend, Tulip. And during that journey, there's loads of stuff. Like they meet the descendant of Jesus Christ, and they meet some lunatic people from various churches. They meet serial killers. There's all sorts of bits and pieces, and they have a lot to deal with about his own kind of redneck family and stuff. Um, it's an okay story. I read it, and at the time I read it, and I was like, yeah, this is enjoyable. This is fine. But it never hit me. It never really did anything that um I found like memorable, or I'd even recommend to other people. So, what's good about Preacher? Well, the writing is good. It's Garth Ennis. It's well put together. It's well paced. It's an enjoyable story. It's got a fair bit of closure at the end. That's fine. Like it's very, as far as I'm concerned, very middle of the road. That's all I have to say about that. Why is it popular? It's popular because it's iconoclastic. And by that, what I mean is it's very irreverential, it's very blasphemous. In fact, when they were trying to make it into a movie, there were loads of concerns about the religious irreverence of a lot of it. So, for example, well, I don't want to give spoilers. When they meet the direct descendant of Jesus Christ, it is not a flattering depiction of the line of Christ. I'll put it that way, for example. And in fact, the entire holy organization that is obsessed with getting hold of Jesse, which is this organization called the Grail, they're all a bunch of nutters with lots of weird things happening to them and doing a lot of weird things. So it's extremely blasphemous. If you're very religious, you'll be offended by this. And in that sense, this is a book that revels in offending people for the sake of offending people. I'm not particularly interested in religion. I don't say that in the way that a lot of people do. A lot of people say, "Oh, I'm not interested in religion," because essentially what's happened is they've grown up in an environment where religion was part of the framework, and they no longer agree with it, and therefore they actively disagree with religion. I don't actively disagree with religion. I just genuinely don't find it a very interesting topic at the best of times. Um, Also, sometimes people say that they're not religious because I guess it's less fashionable to be religious nowadays. We live in 2022. We live in a era of secularism, and whilst it's not enforced secularism, religion is something which isn't as popular as it was, and therefore there is some degree of fashion to kind of be pro-science and to be anti-religion by default, which I think personally doesn't make sense. You don't have to be one to be the other. Um, but again, I'm not really inclined on that either. I'm not anti-religion in that sense. I just don't find it very interesting. And so all this kind of stuff, tearing into religion and mocking religion and deriding religion, which is the constant theme of this comic, deriding Christianity, deriding Catholicism, deriding all these sorts of things. A lot of this is just Garth Ennis's own baggage, having grown up in Ireland. That's all this is. And if you're interested in that, yeah, it's fine and it's funny and it's okay, but it's only fine and it's funny and it's okay. The second thing I didn't like about it is there's a whole thread in this where he meets his redneck family, and his redneck family are an absolute bunch of bastards. They're absolutely horrible. They're really vicious and they're a major threat and so on. And the whole way through, I'm reading this going, why doesn't he just use the word? Like, what is this? What? Like, he has the word of God. He can deal with all these things, but he just doesn't. And in fact, that's like a continuous theme throughout this entire comic. There are so many scenarios where I'm just left there thinking, why didn't he just use the power he has? And in a couple of cases, they even mention it. I think his ex-girlfriend Tulip even says to him, "Why didn't you do that?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, I just forgot." And so we just got into a fight and I had to like punch and kick people and fight our way out. It's like, right, that's just daft. Ultimately, this comes down to a simple truth about Garth Ennis, which is that he doesn't like writing superhero comics. He doesn't like writing comics that aren't really rooted in realism and have an absence of the supernatural and have an absence of science fiction. And yet, in this case, he's written one which is all about the supernatural. It's all about biblical things and magic powers and that sort of stuff. So I guess this is as good a time as any to start to lean towards what we need to talk about, which is Garth Ennis as a writer. Before I do that, I'm just going to say that's my summation of why I don't like Preacher. It's a decent story, it's got decent art, but ultimately it dwells far too much on religion. And quite a lot of the bits in it, I'm just like, why are you writing something about someone with Word of God superpowers when ultimately they never use their Word of God superpowers? Um, it's just, I don't know. It was just deeply unfulfilling for me. And I guess I'm not as young as I was. I guess I'm not interested in religion anymore. I guess I find the whole thing about turning your nose up at religion and giving it the finger and just saying loads of incredibly irrelevant things for the shock factor about religion. Yeah, I just find that boring. I'm not saying it is boring, it's just it's not for me. And as a result, I thought Preacher was okay. And I have some friends, ironically, at least one of them is Irish as well, who I would definitely recommend it to because I know that they would love it and they have read it and they have loved it for all the reasons that I would think because they have an interesting relationship with religion and they like to see it poked fun of. I personally don't. I don't really have an opinion either way, which is why once you remove the shock factor, once you remove the sort of the more tendentious um, idea of poking fun at religion of being blasphemous, then you just have with the story on its own merits, and it doesn't really hold up. That brings us neatly to Garth Ennis. So, Garth Ennis, born 1970, is from Northern Ireland, most famous for Preacher, most famous for his Marvel Comics Punisher run, and obviously, of course, The Boys, which we'll get onto in a second. But ultimately, let's have a quick chat about the stuff that he's famous for. There's Preacher, which I think is probably fair to say one of the major things that launched him. In addition to Preacher, before that he did a lot of stuff in British comics, so Judge Dredd, 2000 AD, stuff like that. I haven't read any of that, so I'm not going to comment on any of that. What I will say is I've read some of his stuff from DC, like Hitman. Now, if you're not familiar with Hitman, this is another series which people absolutely love. I think an omnibus came out recently. It's available in something like 10 trade paperbacks as well. And it's about a dude who essentially, again, kind of has superpowers but doesn't really use them. So Hitman is a character of Tommy Monahan, who is a hitman who ends up getting superpowers from the DC annual event Bloodlines, which I cover in a separate YouTube playlist where I talk about all the DC annual events in the 90s. And basically, the Hitman series is 61 issues of this series about this guy, Tommy Monahan, and his best mate, just basically being gangsters. Now, what is his superpower? Well, the superpower he ends up with is that he essentially becomes slightly telepathic, although being using his telepathy essentially gives him a really bad headache. And he also has X-ray vision, which he uses largely to perv on Wonder Woman in kind of a funny way, but also kind of a pervy way, to be honest. And that's it. He's kind of an anti-hero, and the whole thing about Hitman is that he spends all his time mocking and deriding the DC characters in the universe that he lives in. So he interacts with Superman and Batman and so on, and he just had nothing but contempt for the capes. Um, by capes, I mean that in the broader sense, as in like the superheroes. Like he has nothing but contempt for the Justice League. He doesn't want to join. He doesn't care about any of that sort of stuff. It's very much a street level series, and in that sense, it has hints of things like the Punisher and Daredevil and things like that. Ultimately, much like the Preacher, the fact that Hitman has superpowers is largely irrelevant. Like it's used a couple of times, but largely across the 60 issues, it's him with his gun going around getting into like mad shit. And that's basically all it is. Is it funny? Yes, it is funny. He's a little bit like Constantine. He's a little bit like Jesse from Preacher. And it's a decent read, and I enjoyed reading it. But it's only a decent read. It's again a superhero comic written by someone who doesn't like to write about superheroes, who doesn't like superpowers, who prefers their comics much more realistic, much more gritty, and that's what Hitman is. But at the same time, it does it with a long theme of irreverence and childishness. Um, so, for example, I'm trying to remember here. There's a particular character in Hitman who is who has the preface Master. You know the way some people are called Mister or Mrs. or Duke or whatever. He's called Master, and his name is Beta. Bater. What this means is that he keeps on announcing himself and yelling his name by saying, I am Master Beta. This is the level of humor and the level of maturity one can expect from Hitman. I'm not saying it's not funny, I'm just saying this is what to expect. And as such, I also don't like Hitman. I read it and it's decent. And again, there's people I recommended it to, and because I know the people I recommend these things to, they absolutely loved it. But it's not for me. It's just kind of, it's not realistic and gritty enough to be a good gritty realistic comic, and it's not superhero-y enough to be a good superhero comic. This is just 60 issues of Garth Ennis getting out of his system how much he dislikes writing superhero comics, but he was getting paid to write a superhero comic. So not a fan of Hitman either. He's written a whole bunch of other stuff. Obviously, there's Hellblazer, which was a thing that made him really put him on the map, I guess, before Preacher. I haven't read any of his Hellblazer. I've heard good things, and I'm looking forward to it. But Hellblazer is a lot. We're looking at several hundred issues there, so I haven't read that yet. Of course, there's Preacher, as I just mentioned, and then he's written loads of other things like war stories and a variety of other kind of more realistic kind of comics, which I also haven't read. In that vein, we've got to look at his Marvel Comics works. He's written a whole load of Punisher stuff, and his Punisher stuff is amazing. And this, I think, is where Garth Ennis shines, is when you're writing something which is about characters that don't even have the slightest hint of superpowers. There's no kind of, oh, they have the word of God, but they forget to use it, or oh, he's telepathic, but it gives him a headache. The Punisher is the dude with the gun. And in that, Ennis's Punisher run is utterly, utterly fantastic. It's one of the greatest Punisher runs of all time, in my opinion. I haven't actually read that much Punisher, to be fair. And it is spectacular. And that's because you have someone just doing gritty, street level comics that isn't being conflicted, isn't being pulled in terms of his two other passions. One is trying to be blasphemous and derogatory about religion, and two is reluctantly writing superhero comics even though you don't want to. Those are the two key things that we have to take away from Garth Ennis, from his bibliography. And the Punisher skirts both of those, so the Punisher is great. He's also written stuff like Wildstorm, the Kev comics, so the Authority, the Kev, and the Authority, more Kev, and the Authority, Magnificent Kevin. These are all comics under the Wildstorm imprint, and again, these fit into the broad category of comics that Garth Ennis wrote about superheroes, but he hates writing about superheroes. And of course, there is absolutely no way that I can talk about that without mentioning The Boys. So The Boys is what Garth Ennis is quite possibly going to be most famous for the rest of time. It is, of course, the Amazon Prime series. There's 3 seasons that have come out, and it is based on the comic that he's written and published, which I think ends with 70 issues, 72 issues. What I'll say about The Boys is I really enjoy it. I really like it. It's really fun. I would recommend it to anyone that can handle the kind of puerile adolescence of it all. You know, people getting blown up with bombs inside vibrators and dildos, and constant jokes about sex and menstruation and feces, and even like constant scenes of pedophilia and rape and all sorts of bizarre things going on in it. The Boys is good, but what The Boys is Garth Ennis fully leaning into, I guess 15, 20 years into his career, fully leaning into how much he hates superheroes and wants to write a comic about how much he hates superheroes. And that's what The Boys is. It's purely that. It's a comic about how much he hates superheroes, and that's it. And in that sense, it's good, but it has got a lot of childish stuff in it. And so, what I would say is, whilst I enjoy it, and whilst I'm very glad I've got the definitive editions, which are massively out of print now, it is something where you have to stick your tongue in your cheek and accept that there's a huge lack of maturity in this comic. So the Boys, take it or leave it. I do enjoy it. I'm never going to do a video diving into it because there's so many others out there. But that's what that's indulging in the Garth Ennis appetite. It's indulging his desire to just show how much he hates superheroes. And it hasn't got any real religious aspects to it. And so we've cleaned up that side of things. Obviously, Garth Ennis' bibliography is way more than the stuff that I've just covered here in brief. But in a nutshell, the way that I like to think about it is all of his comics can be viewed as, is this him either processing and dealing with how much he dislikes superheroes? So, for example, is it something like Hitman? Or is it something like Preacher? Or is it even something like The Boys? Or is this something talking about how much he dislikes religion? In which case, Preacher is again the perfect example. Preacher, of course, is part of the perfect storm where it's both a dislike of superheroes and a dislike of religion. And I can see why it's popular. But as I say, for me, I need a little bit more bang for my buck. That's why, for my money, one of the best Garth Ennis runs I've got and read is the Punisher one, where he's not preoccupied by just generally being derogatory towards religion and generally making fun of superheroes. It's all just Punisher Max. And in fact, Punisher Max itself is a Marvel. Oh, it's Earth 2001 something. Anyway, it's a Marvel multiverse where there aren't any superheroes in it, and that's how it works, and is great as a result. I'd like to wrap up, but I guess just to bring it full circle, if you're reading Preacher, feel free to enjoy it. It's a good comic. If you love Preacher, brilliant, great for you. But the truth is, if you love Preacher, what you like about it is going to be some of the anti-religion stuff, because there's no way to like Preacher unless you're getting on board with a lot of the anti-religion narrative. And also you like Preacher because you're not necessarily into superhero comics, and he hardly ever uses the superpower, if that's what you want to call it, that he's given at the start of the series. And that's what the Preacher comic is. If, like me, you're really a fan of superhero comics, which I very much am, and if, like me, you prefer your non-superhero comics to be sort of quite crisp and clean and gritty, like Ennis's Punisher. Preacher isn't that. It's kind of wacky, it's kind of zany, and it is hung up on the anti-religion thing in a big way. And so as a result, um, if you're like me and you have my kind of tastes, I have no shame in saying that I'm not a fan of Preacher. I don't like it at all. I wouldn't own it in my collection. I'm not a fan of Hitman. I don't like it at all. I wouldn't own it in my collection. I tried watching the Preacher TV show, which I think is also on Amazon Prime. Is it made by AMC? It's made by someone. But I tried watching that because I'm a massive fan of the lead actor in it. And I just tailed off like 5 or 6 episodes in, not because it was bad, just because it was dull. And that's just me. That's just me. And hey, maybe that's just you as well. Maybe you've read Preacher, maybe you've heard all the hype, maybe you've seen everyone banging on about it, maybe you're thinking of getting the absolute editions. What I would say is read it first. It's not necessarily for everyone, and I think it's okay not to like it, and I don't like it. I do like his Punisher stuff. I like that a lot. I think that's amazing. And I quite enjoyed his boys stuff. Although, to be fair, I think the Amazon Prime series does quite a few aspects of that much better. But the comics is, I've got a soft spot for it because he just really consistently leans into the I hate superheroes thing in that. Well, there we are. That's my overview of Preacher and why it's a popular comic it's okay not to like. And of course, it's obviously part of the whole process of talking about Garth Ennis and his other work and so on. And I want to leave you with this. The next video that I'm going to drop, um, other than my sort of my weekly standard Valiant series that I'm currently doing, I want to talk about an unpopular comic that it's okay to like. And in that, what I'm going to talk about is, and I say this with no hyperbole, literally the best Garth Ennis comic ever written. A comic written by Garth Ennis, which is so good and so staggering that it is breathtaking in its literary worth and merit and genius. I'm going to talk about a Garth Ennis comic which really I believe all Garth Ennis fans should read, and in fact, almost everyone should read if they can stomach it because it is utterly staggeringly brilliant. And I'll be talking about that next time. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. As always, please follow me on Twitter at I am Thomas Judge, where I will post a daily review of whatever comics I've been reading. You can get an idea of what I'm up to on the channel. And as always, please support the channel by heading over to Amazon.com and checking out my prose novel about superheroes. It's a completely original piece of work. The first episode in it is called Arrivals, and the series as a whole is called No Gods or Kings. You can find an excerpt of that on my website, nogodsorkings.com. Until next time, everybody, stay classy.